Hello, this is Sonja Jones of GFP Financials or Mr. Miyagi of Money, and welcome to the From Chaos to Clarity Unleash Your Business Potential podcast. And on this episode right here, we are talking about something near and dear to my heart: nonprofits. Hello, hey nonprofits, how y'all doing? How y'all doing? So we're going to talk a little bit about how nonprofits can get clarity by establishing two documents that I personally feel every nonprofit should have. I know most nonprofits, especially when forming their organizations, they focus on the bylaws, which are well and good. However, from a financial standpoint, nonprofits should have two particular documents, if not already completed, but at least in development, even if it's a one pager. It's your financial policy and what we call your internal control narrative, right? And so I'm going to talk about those particular documents, why they are important, and give you very surface level objectives for each particular document. Okay. I've seen it in organizations where the financial policy includes the internal controls in the same document. For those of you who don't know, my particular expertise is in nonprofit finance. I was founding director of finance and operations for a local charter school here in Memphis for 10 years. And so for us, we had a financial policy as well as an internal control narrative, because that was what was required of us as a charter school in the state of Tennessee, right? And also because we received state and federal funding, we had to conduct an audit every year. And when we conducted said audit, we had to have those particular documents on hand at all times, and they had to be reviewed and adjusted annually, right? So I want to talk to nonprofits about financial policy and the internal control narrative. So, what is the financial policy? The biggest purpose of the financial policy is that it identifies and assigns authority to certain financial functions within the organization. It tells you who can do what with the money, and certain thresholds when it comes to money functions, right? So, with that being said, I'm just going to give you a couple of things that I feel will probably be kind of like underlying things, regardless if your nonprofit is a startup versus an established organization, because every nonprofit should have a board of directors. So that's important. So in your financial policy, it should include, but it's definitely not limited to, your bank accounts. Who should be a signer on your organization's bank account or accounts, right? If checks are written, how many signers need to be on the check? And if the check is going to be written for a certain amount, there should be some, you know, additional functions and procedures that should take place between $100 check and $100,000 check, right? So if the organization is writing a $100,000 check, there should be some authorizations taking place, right? Second thing, when it comes to the budget, the operating budget, who approves the budget? When is the budget approved? It's going to be based on your fiscal year. If your fiscal year starts on July 1st, normally the new budget needs to be approved before the end of the current fiscal year, which is June 30th. It really depends. Everybody's fiscal year is not the same. Um, and most of the clients that we've worked with, the fiscal year either runs July 1st to June 30th or January the 1st to December 31st. If you don't know, if you're a nonprofit, you don't know your when your fiscal year ends, take a look at your 501c3 letter because it will let you know um, when the month that your fiscal year ends. Okay. So who approves the budget? And then also, if the budget needs to be modified, there should be in the financial policy say if the budget needs to be adjusted, meaning what if you got a new grant, right, that you weren't expecting is adding an extra $50 to $100,000, right, to your operating budget. That money needs to be acknowledged and approved by the board in some way, shape, or form. But the amount of that adjustment threshold needs to be included in your financial policy, right? Sometimes it may be 10,000, sometimes it may be 50 to 100,000. Also, when it comes to your expenditures, right? If your expenditures need to be adjusted, like say for staffing, you had budgeted to spend about 500,000 right on staff, but somebody left, and you weren't able to um, fill that role. So now you're showing that whatever the remainder of that salary is still showing in staffing, but you may need to move that money to another expense line to cover something, right? Those types of changes need to be approved, presented to the board, and approved by the board. So the budget can be adjusted accordingly, right? So those are some of the particular scenarios. Um, Not through, I forgot a couple of them. Conflict of interest. Oh my goodness, right? If you if you have large vendor contracts, right, or vendor contracts, period, right, the board should be aware of those vendor contracts, and somebody on the board, whether it's the board treasurer or somebody like that, there should be a system or a process of vetting to ensure that the contractor, right, does not have a conflict of interest with anybody on the board or anybody in like executive leadership for the organization, right? So, say for example, oh, pardon me, um, like if you are on the board and your cousin does a particular type of work, like networking or something like that. The organization has a building and y'all need an overhaul in your network infrastructure, and your cousin does it, right? That may be a conflict of interest, right? So you don't want to be in a situation where um, the organization is writing a check and then they find out later on that it's your cousin, and then God forbid your cousin end up on the news because your cousin was doing something they had no business doing, right? So in situations like that, every contract, in my opinion, needs to be presented to the board, regardless of um, the amount, right? So you have to take those things into consideration within the contracts. If it depends on a certain amount of, or whatever the vendor contract is going to be, does that particular amount or higher needs to be approved by the board. But then also conflict of interest, it has to be in the financial policy, has to be in there. Okay. And then also when it comes to um, audits, or even just talking to, like say if your organization has an outsourced bookkeeping or CPA firm, which leaders of the board, which members of the board have the authority to be the liaison between the CPA or the bookkeeper or the auditor and the board, right? Those types of things. You need to have those things documented because you just don't want board members just contacting, you know, the financial representatives of your organization and making them mad. Right. That's just not a good look. You have to have a designated liaison. It's just best practice. All right. So those are some of the things that should be in your financial policy. It's definitely not limited to because, like I said, every nonprofit is different, and those particular policies, in most cases, are established by the governing board. Next thing is your internal control narrative, right? Or your some people just call it the internal controls. So the difference between the financial policy and the internal controls is while the financial policy assigns authority, the internal controls is pretty much kind of like your standard operating procedures for all your financial functions within the organization. So it's basically outlining um, which job titles handle specific money functions, right? How often that they engage in said function, and then what's the actual process, right? So, especially when it comes to your internal controls, you never, 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 as best practice, identify names, actual names, excuse me, in the internal control. You always address roles by their specific job title. So, say for example, um, I will be acknowledged as the director of finance and operations. They don't say Sonja handles the cash. They say the director of finance and operations handles the cash, right? So make sure that you're addressing those functions as such. Also within the financial policy as well, you don't want to address anybody by name, right? And then some of the other things when it comes to the internal control narrative is cash. Who receives the cash? Who issues receipts for the cash, right? When you're issuing the receipts, what do the receipts look like? Are y'all getting the receipt books from a particular company? Are you getting them from Office Depot or Office Max, right? I mean, it has to be super detailed because you know, on the receipt books, like how many copies do you have the white, then the pink, then the yellow? Are you just doing the white and the pink? Like I think it's the two set or the three set, things like that. And then if you do that, which copy goes to which person, right? All those things have to be detailed. I mean, it's like that. Payroll, who processes payroll? How often is payroll run? What does the payroll processing process look like, right? Um, if you have any positions in your organization that are salary, what does that payroll processing system look like? Payroll process looks like. If you have anybody that's hourly and they have to do timesheets, all that has to be addressed in the internal control. The particular payroll system that you're using has to be addressed in the internal control. Um, Deposits. Who's authorized to prepare the deposit? What does the deposit process look like? How often are you making deposits to said bank, right? Will you document the deposit? Do you have a deposit log for every check that comes in? Are you making photocopies of the check, which you should? That's best practice. That type of thing, right? Paying bills. Who's authorized to write a check to pay a bill in your organization? Which which role? Which job title? How often are y'all paying bills? Are you paying bills through your accounting software? Are you guys actually physically writing the check? Are you using the online bill pay system in your checking account? What does that look like? And especially if you are paying bills and you're doing it in a batch type of system, please make sure that you have some type of approval system for paying all those bills at one time. Like if you're doing an invoice batch process, somebody needs to be approving, like I approve that these bills need to be paid, which means that that individual has looked through each invoice, each check that is written to verify that these are for real, legitimate, bona fide expenses and they are not just writing out checks to somebody's cousin, right? Applying for grants. Which job title applies for the grant or grants, right? Um, if the grant is awarded, who acknowledges and accepts the award of the grant? When the grant is received after it's deposited, um, how is the grant tracked, right? And especially if it's a grant that needs to be reimbursed, that whole process needs to be documented. Asset management, right? Because your technology, anything that's over a fixed threshold amount, I forgot to mention in the financial policy, there should be something called a capitalization policy, meaning that any equipment that is priced over a certain amount will need to be depreciated, right? Whether it's furniture or fixtures, whether it's computer equipment, technology, not just computers, but like big copiers, projectors, servers, or whatever. Even if you have vehicles in your organization, even if you have large, what we call capital expenditures, like say if you have a roof put on or if you have a new HVAC system that was installed, those things need to be depreciated because those things are going to be put in place and in performing for long periods of time for the organization. So you have to have in your financial policy for those assets, what's the how much does the asset need to be, right, to be considered to be depreciated. Also, how long will that particular asset need to be depreciated? um I know when I was in my former function, furniture was 3 years. No, technology was 3 years. Furniture and fixture was 5 years, right? Of course, if it's a capital expenditure, like when we're talking about the roof and stuff like that, those things will probably be depreciated for longer periods of time. But that's why you need the expertise of a CPA or somebody that will be able to give you proper guidance on how to, depreciate said assets. And then also accounting software management. Um, if you do decide to engage with a CPA or a bookkeeper and they're using accounting software, um, who has the authority to be a user and log into the accounting software, right? Because there's different levels, of access. Who can go in there and just look at the stuff, but who also can go in there and actually edit financial information. All that needs to be. Those are just some of the parameters of the internal control narrative. Definitely not all of them, right? Because I see so many nonprofits that don't have these things in place, and you never want to be in a situation where, um, from a compliance standpoint, maybe somebody from the state or a grantor, right, that is giving you money and they are asking you for said procedures and you don't have them in place, or if it's something federal, if you're filing your 990 and something's required on your 990 to where like you're not, especially your full 990s, they're going to ask for everybody on your board, right? And they might ask some other questions that could easily be identified if you have these two documents in place, right? So your financial policy and your internal control narrative, nonprofits, are very important, right? And even if you're just starting out, if you got a one pager, at least you got something that you can stand on and it can grow with you, right? So your bylaws, your financial policy, and your internal control narratives, those are fundamental. You got to have them, y'all. got to have them, right? If you need assistance, nonprofits, with creating these documents, please get in touch with us because we actually have planning sessions where we'll walk you through. We don't have templates per se. We like the approach of offering you kind of like a planning worksheet with guiding questions as opposed to a template because every nonprofit is different. But we will definitely give you, the commonly, asked questions or the commonly used scenarios to kind of get your brains turning so you can sit with your executive leadership and your governing board on how to plan for those particular questions and stuff like that. So those things are important. All right, so I wanted to make sure that I dedicated at least one episode to the nonprofits. Of course, this will not be the only episode I dedicate to the nonprofits, but I wanted to make sure that I put this out here for y'all to have. And please share this with every nonprofit that you know because these two documents are super essential. Maybe we may do a class on creating your financial policy and internal controls. We shall see, depending on what the demand is. All right. So again, thank y'all for attending the From Chaos to Clarity Unleash Your Business Potential podcast. I am your host, Sonja Jones of GIP Financial, your Mr. Miyagi of Money, and we will see you on the next episode. Toodaloo.
Thank y'all so much for listening to the From Chaos to Clarity Unleash Your Business Potential podcast. Again, I'm Sonja Jones of GIP Financials, your Mr. Miyagi of Money, but I got a couple of homework assignments for you before you leave this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also leave a comment and let us know what your biggest takeaways were from this episode. And if you are looking for bookkeeping assistance or you need a money thought buddy, make sure that you go to our website, www.gipfinancials.com, and click on the schedule a consultation button at the top of our website, little green box. And you can schedule a discovery call and talk to one of our teammates to see if we're a good fit. All right. See you guys on the next episode. Take care.